December 16, 1944, 0530 hours. Ardennes Forest. Sector Schnee Eifel. Oberstleutnant Karl Weber crouched in a snow-covered foxhole, peering through the dim morning haze. His 88mm flak gun, positioned with painstaking precision, gleamed like a dark promise under the pale winter sun. In his pocket, a photograph of his young daughter bundled in scarves reminded him of what he was fighting for, or so he told himself. The Ardennes would be our proving ground. The Allies will stumble before our might, and the fatherland will endure. Just days earlier, Weber had meticulously calculated the artillery coordinates with his battery officers. Every map, every measurement, every charted elevation was double-checked. The panzer columns, reinforced with fresh armor and the hopes of the high command, were poised to punch through the thin American lines. Victory seemed almost inevitable, but the Allies had something new, something the Wehrmacht had neither anticipated nor prepared for. The proximity fuse. A small, unassuming device hidden in the heart of their artillery shells, capable of detonating above the target with terrifying precision. Weber had heard rumors, whispered from captured scouts and intercepted messages, of shells that exploded mid-air with catastrophic effect. He dismissed them as propaganda. No weapon could tear entire formations from existence in an instant, could it? By midday, the snow would be stained with the unexpected, the deadly arithmetic of modern warfare. Entire companies of German infantry and armored vehicles would vanish in fire and shrapnel, erased not by the valor of the enemy, but by science itself. And Weber, standing just a few kilometers away, would come to understand that the rules of the battlefield had changed, that his careful calculations meant nothing against the invisible hand of technological innovation. The Battle of the Bulge, history would record, was not merely a clash of armies or a test of strategy. It became the proving ground for ingenuity, for adaptation, and for the stark realization that even the most formidable formations could be undone in a heartbeat. The morning fog lingered low over the Ardennes, curling around the skeletal trees and blanketing the frozen ground in deceptive calm. Oberleutnant Dieter Brandt huddled beside his Panzer IV, the tracks frozen stiff with ice, the engine growling softly beneath the hood. He glanced at the column ahead, tanks, half-tracks, and infantry trudging through the snow, and felt the familiar surge of confidence that comes with carefully rehearsed plans. The Americans, he thought, would never anticipate the speed or ferocity of our advance. Every calculation, every map, every reconnaissance report indicated an easy breakthrough. His orders were clear: strike fast, hit hard, and seize the key crossroads before the sun set. But the first shell landed well ahead of the leading panzer, erupting in a cloud of snow and splintered wood. Brandt squinted, disbelief mixing with fear. The explosion had come too early, too precisely. Shrapnel rained down across the tree line. A half-track behind him was ripped apart, the driver thrown forward as if the earth itself had erupted. By noon, the columns that had been marching confidently through the Ardennes were shattered. Soldiers scrambled for cover, their voices hoarse with panic. Entire formations previously thought invulnerable were gone in moments. Observers would later note that no direct hits had been necessary. The proximity fuse detonated shells just above the ground, sending lethal fragments in every direction. The technology seemed almost supernatural to the German troops, a ghostly adversary striking from nowhere. Brandt's diary, discovered decades later, would record his astonishment. "We were trained to fight men and machines, but this is as if the sky itself conspires against us. No fortification, no maneuver, no courage could withstand it. The Ardennes became a laboratory of destruction, where German assumptions about artillery, formation, and timing were violently tested and found fatally flawed. Every attempt to regroup, every maneuver to shield the advancing units, met with the same invisible hand, raining death from above with unerring consistency." By evening, the first true measure of the proximity fuse's power became clear. Whole battalions had vanished from the map, their radio reports static with confusion. The once confident Wehrmacht officers could only stare at the wreckage, trying to reconcile the scale of destruction with the seemingly ordinary shells that had wrought it. As dusk settled over the Ardennes, the frozen terrain glimmered under the pale light of the setting sun. Oberstleutnant Heinrich Vogt, commanding the 116th Panzer Division, traced the remains of his once proud formations. Tanks sat overturned in ditches, their turrets twisted at impossible angles. Half-tracks were reduced to splintered husks, the soldiers within either casualties or fleeing in disoriented terror. He had studied Allied artillery reports, had trained his men to expect concentrated barrages and to disperse under fire. Yet none of his calculations had prepared him for this. The Americans were firing shells that seemed to anticipate every movement, exploding not upon impact, but in midair with an invisible intelligence. Corporal Fritz Langner, recording observations in his field notebook, wrote, "It is as if the sky itself knows our plans. We hide behind trees, behind ridges, behind our tanks, yet the fragments find us. Each explosion scatters our formations like autumn leaves in a gale. We have never faced an enemy like this." The proximity fuse, a secret weapon that would later be declassified and studied by historians, fundamentally altered battlefield dynamics. Unlike traditional shells which required direct hits, these munitions detonated when they came within lethal range of their targets, maximizing shrapnel dispersal and annihilating tightly packed units. By nightfall, Brandt and Vogt convened with surviving officers to assess losses. Maps were marked with red ink, tracking units that had ceased to exist. Communications were sporadic, fragmented by panic. The reality was undeniable. Entire formations had been effectively erased in a matter of hours. Witnesses later recalled the psychological impact as devastating as the physical. Men who had trained under the iron discipline of the Wehrmacht, soldiers who had survived North Africa, Stalingrad, and the French campaign, were now paralyzed by fear. The sky, once a neutral expanse, had become a lethal opponent, and the ground beneath them, no sanctuary at all. It was a lesson that would haunt the German High Command, no matter how disciplined, how experienced, how strategically superior their armor and troops might seem. Technological innovation could render all prior assumptions obsolete. In the Ardennes, the proximity fuse had rewritten the rules of warfare, leaving the Wehrmacht scrambling to survive in a theater where every moment of confidence was met with instant annihilation. First reports of the proximity fuse's effects reached General Feldmarschall Walter Model in the early hours of December 18, 1944. He studied maps smeared with red ink and stared at the scattered remnants of his divisions. Over the radio, messengers described entire battalions being shredded before they could even take up defensive positions. Major Karl Heinze, assigned to coordinate artillery support, recounted later. "We tried to regroup to form firing lines, but the Americans seemed to know exactly where we would be. Every attempt to mass men or equipment ended in carnage. We were ghosts moving through a graveyard of our own making. The Americans had deployed M82 shells, each containing a miniature radio transmitter and receiver, capable of detecting the presence of enemy vehicles or massed troops. Once within a predetermined proximity, the fuse triggered detonation, showering anything beneath with deadly steel fragments. Even the Luftwaffe, called in to provide air support, could do little. Low visibility, coupled with American anti-aircraft guns synchronized with artillery fire, turned every sortie into a gamble. Pilots, once confident in their ability to spot and strike armored formations, now found their efforts frustrated as shell bursts rained down on previously hidden positions. By the end of the 6th day, the German High Command could no longer deny the strategic impact. The proximity fuse had done more than destroy tanks and infantry. It had erased the confidence of an entire army. Units no longer maneuvered freely. They hesitated, scattered, and often surrendered without engagement. American planners recognized the profound psychological effect as much as the tactical. Fear had become a weapon as lethal as the shells themselves. The morning of December 19th dawned with a fragile, pale light over the Ardennes, but the battlefield was far from tranquil. Smoke still rose from shattered villages, and the cries of the wounded echoed faintly through the frozen woods. German formations, once confident in their armored might, moved like shadows, wary of every sound, every flicker of movement. The proximity fuse had instilled a new kind of fear, one that could not be shaken by conventional countermeasures. Oberleutnant Franz Müller, leading a small contingent of panzer grenadiers, described the surreal nature of the battlefield. It was as if the earth itself had turned against us. Shells exploded in the sky and we could see nothing. Trees, roads, even the snow seemed to betray our positions. Our tanks, our artillery, they were no longer our allies, but sitting ducks in a storm we could neither predict nor control. The psychological toll was mirrored by tactical collapse. Small units that had once coordinated meticulously now advanced in isolation, fearing that any concentration would invite annihilation. Commanders tried to rally their men, shouting orders over the wind and gunfire, but responses were slow, hesitant, almost mechanical. The Americans' meticulous mapping and forward observation meant that every German maneuver, no matter how cautious, risked instant destruction. Even elite units, hardened veterans of campaigns across France and the Eastern Front, were forced into retreat or disarray. Reports surfaced of entire companies abandoning vehicles in the middle of advanced corridors, fleeing into the forest to escape invisible airbursts. The fuse had blurred the line between front and rear, turning every step into a potential death sentence. The psychological warfare extended beyond immediate fear. Soldiers began to question their equipment, their strategies, and even the competence of their commanders. Proximity-fused artillery had created an omnipresent threat, one that no human skill or bravery could entirely counter. Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Becker wrote in his journal, "We had trained for months to fight with discipline and precision, but discipline alone could not shield us from an enemy who struck without warning, above our heads, before we even knew we were targets." As the day progressed, the effect of the fuses became indisputable. Entire German formations dissolved into fragmented units, lost in the snow-covered forest with morale in tatters. American forces, meanwhile, advanced with cautious efficiency, aware that each salvo of proximity-fused shells had sown not just destruction but confusion, a force multiplier far beyond its explosive power. By evening, it was clear that the Bulge would not be a series of tactical engagements alone. It had become a study in modern warfare, precision-guided fear, a combination of technology and psychology, which erased not just tanks and infantry, but the very confidence of an army. By the evening of December 19th, the Ardennes landscape had been transformed into a tableau of chaos and eerie silence, punctuated only by distant bursts of artillery fire and the occasional crackle of small arms. Entire German formations, once disciplined and coordinated, had been reduced to scattered groups, crawling through the snow and mud, their morale shattered by the invisible menace above. The proximity fuses had done more than destroy tanks and infantry. They had rewritten the psychological landscape of warfare itself. Colonel James Parker of the 3rd U.S. Army observed the aftermath with a mixture of awe and somber reflection. He later recounted, "We had always known artillery could break lines, but the way the Germans simply melted away, it was unprecedented. It wasn't just physics. It was fear manifested in steel and snow. The American gunners, trained meticulously in fuse settings and target zones, had created a weapon that was both precise and terrifyingly unpredictable to the enemy. The survivors of the German units described a sense of invisibility and omnipresence. Everywhere we moved, death was waiting above us," wrote Gefreiter Otto Lenz in a report. "We could see nothing, hear nothing until the earth itself erupted, and men around us disappeared like ghosts." These accounts reveal that the fuses had not only killed, but had instilled a pervasive dread, leaving soldiers hesitant to advance, to communicate, even to breathe in open areas. From the American perspective, the proximity fuse was a triumph of engineering and tactical innovation. By allowing shells to detonate above the target, it maximized shrapnel dispersion, eliminated cover, and disrupted formations with a precision previously impossible in massed artillery barrages. Entire attacks collapsed before they could fully materialize, as if the fuses were reading the minds of the German commanders and preemptively unraveling their plans. As night fell over the Ardennes, the remnants of the German offensive had ceased to exist in any meaningful form. The Bulge, intended as a decisive counterstroke, had been thwarted not merely by numbers or position, but by technology that imposed a new kind of battlefield reality. Soldiers, historians, and strategists alike would later recognize this moment as a turning point in modern warfare, the day when fear and innovation combined to erase entire formations before the enemy could fully engage. So, the quiet that followed. The American forces consolidated their positions, aware that the battle was far from over, yet understanding that they had witnessed the emergence of a weapon that redefined both strategy and human psychology on the battlefield. Proximity fuses would not only remain a key factor in World War II, but would also serve as a harbinger of future conflicts, where technology would challenge the very notion of courage and human calculation. By dawn, the Ardennes bore silent testimony to the power of innovation. Frozen forests, shattered vehicles, and the ghosts of formations that had vanished almost as if they had never existed. The Allies had learned a crucial lesson. The battlefield could now be controlled not just by men and tanks, but by the invisible hand of ingenuity and the relentless certainty of science. Unlike traditional bombardments, which relied on impact or timed shells, the fuse required no precision targeting. Dense formations, tightly stacked tanks, or columns of marching infantry were effectively obliterated with frightening efficiency. Where German artillery had once dominated the battlefield, now it seemed impotent against the invisible sensor in the sky. For the men on the ground, the psychological effect was immediate. Oberfeldwebel Dietrich Kramer, a veteran of Kursk and Normandy, described it in his memoirs. "We could hear the whistling approach of the shells, but not the impact. The explosion would come before we even understood what was happening. Men shouted orders, tried to run, but there was nowhere safe. It was as if the heavens themselves had turned against us." By the evening of the first day, German armored units were scattered, infantry morale shattered, and the integrity of the Ardennes offensive began to crumble. Commanders realized that traditional tactics, tight formations, massed assaults, coordinated armored advances, were now suicidal against a foe armed with knowledge, innovation, and the terrifying foresight of the proximity fuse. In private diaries, soldiers questioned not only their survival, but the very logic of the war. How could a technologically inferior nation, with fewer resources, deliver such destruction without direct engagement? It was a revelation that shook the Wehrmacht to its core. The American war machine did not merely fight battles, it redefined them. The morning after the first devastating volleys, General Hasso von Manteuffel toured the remnants of his panzer divisions. Tanks lay smoldering in the frozen mud, their tracks twisted and gouged as if some invisible hand had ripped them apart. Soldiers huddled in shell craters, faces pale, hands trembling. The proximity fuse had made traditional defenses obsolete overnight. Lieutenant Friedrich Adler, commanding a platoon of Panthers, recorded in his journal. "We moved cautiously along the forest road, each step measured. Then it came, a scream from the sky, and the earth erupted. Half my men vanished before I could even shout a warning. It was not artillery. It was a force that knew where we were, even before we did. American gunners, operating under meticulously calculated fire plans, could launch barrages at suspected assembly points without ever visually confirming targets. Reconnaissance had pinpointed locations where German units would likely converge, and the proximity fuse did the rest. Columns of tanks and trucks, which in previous campaigns could maneuver with relative safety, were now instantly vulnerable. The efficiency of the fuses became evident in unit reports. Entire infantry companies were disbanded within minutes, vehicles shredded, and morale irreparably damaged. German command struggled to adapt. Conventional countermeasures, digging in, dispersing formations, or moving under cover, offered limited relief. Even anti-aircraft flak, which had previously dominated the skies, proved ineffective against the rapid, precise fire of American artillery armed with proximity fuses. For the soldiers on the ground, fear became a constant companion. Unteroffizier Hans Becker wrote, "We had faced tanks, bombs, and machine guns, but nothing had prepared us for this. The fuse hunted us, even in the trees, even in the snow. Every shadow was a threat, every second a countdown to oblivion. By the third day of the offensive, the cumulative effect was undeniable. German commanders began referring to the fuses as ghost shells, unseen, relentless, and unerring. The Ardennes, once considered an avenue for a decisive German counterattack, had become a crucible of terror, where technological innovation, not sheer numbers, dictated the fate of armies. The night of December 18, 1944, brought little comfort to the battered German formations. Snow fell steadily, blanketing the Ardennes in deceptive serenity. Yet beneath the quiet white surface, the Americans' technological advantage continued to shape the battlefield. Observation posts reported flickering shadows in the woods, fleeting glimpses of what remained of panzer divisions. Any movement, no matter how slight, drew immediate attention, and often, destruction. Gefreiter Karl Heinemann, crawling through a shattered village to check on his men, recounted later, "The fuse was everywhere. We could hear it before it struck, a faint whistle, and then the ground would tear open. Sometimes it was too close to look. Sometimes it struck where nothing should have been. It was as if the Americans knew our thoughts." The integration of radio communications with forward observers allowed American batteries to react in seconds, guiding proximity fuse shells with frightening precision. Every German attempt at regrouping was met with near-instant artillery barrages. Columns of vehicles were reduced to twisted metal, and infantry movements were shredded before they could coalesce into a coherent counterattack. By now, morale was fracturing. Unteroffizier Dietrich Vogel noted, men who had faced the fiercest tanks, the heaviest guns, and the mightiest bombs were now terrified of a shell that detonated in the air, sometimes hundreds of meters above us. It was not courage we lacked, it was hope. And when hope is gone, so is discipline. Commanders attempted to adapt, instructing units to disperse, move under tree cover, and avoid predictable routes. Yet each tactic offered only temporary respite. The combination of radio coordination, meticulous fire planning, and the proximity fuze's deadly efficiency made the battlefield unpredictable. Units that had survived previous campaigns intact now disintegrated under the weight of invisible, omnipresent fire.